The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II touched down at Bagram Airfield, with hydraulic fluid streaming from its starboard wing like arterial blood. Ground crew scrambled as the titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit glinted under Afghan sun. Canopy fractured into a spiderweb of cracks that shouldn't have allowed controlled flight. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans wound down with their characteristic low growl. That sound every grunt on the ground knew meant salvation was overhead. But something was wrong. The crew chief reached the aircraft first, his hand already on the ladder when he froze. The cockpit was empty. Not abandoned, empty. Combat empty. The ejection seat remained intact, harness still buckled, but no pilot occupied the space. On the instrument panel, held in place by the stick itself, a small American flag stood upright, its fabric unstained despite the carnage evident throughout the aircraft. Behind him, a SEAL team that had just returned from a 48-hour direct action mission stopped their debrief. Their lieutenant commander, a man who'd seen 3 combat deployments and whose face rarely registered surprise, walked toward the A-10 with the kind of reverence usually reserved for flag-draped coffins. He rendered a salute. Then his entire team followed suit. Within minutes, every operator, pilot, mechanic, and clerk on that flight line stood at attention, hands raised to brow, honoring an empty cockpit and a flag that shouldn't have made it home. The intelligence officer who'd been tracking the mission couldn't explain it. The last radio transmission had come in 40 minutes prior, during a troops in contact scenario in the Korangal Valley. Call sign Reaper 21 had been providing close air support for a surrounded Marine rifle company, her GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon tearing through enemy positions with the precision that made the A-10 a legend. Then silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of someone who'd made a choice. The aircraft had flown itself home using automation nobody knew the A-10 possessed, guided by inputs that suggested intimate knowledge of emergency protocols and a pilot's final act of will. But who was Reaper 21? The roster listed Captain Marlo Torrance, a 32-year-old former Air National Guard pilot who transferred to active duty after distinguished service in Iraq. The personnel file was thin, too thin. She'd logged over 2,000 hours in the A-10, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross during the Battle of Mosul, and volunteered for every close air support mission that others found too dangerous or politically complicated. Her call sign wasn't assigned by squadron tradition. She'd earned it during a night mission over Ramadi when she'd stayed on station for 4 hours past bingo fuel, refusing to leave until every Marine made it back inside the wire. They'd called her the Reaper because she harvested enemy combatants with a farmer's patience and a surgeon's precision. But in the ready room, some of the newer pilots had whispered different stories. They said she was washed up, that her tactics were outdated, that she flew angry instead of smart. The executive officer had even questioned her mission readiness 3 weeks prior, suggesting she take a desk job at headquarters, let the younger pilots handle the kinetic operations. Marlo had responded by flying 17 consecutive missions without incident, each one a masterclass in close air support that made the after-action reports read like technical manuals written by someone who loved the infantrymen more than glory. Now her A-10 sat on the ramp, and nobody could find her body. The Marines she'd saved in the Korangal were already being extracted, their after-action reports describing fire support so accurate it had threaded between their own positions and enemy fighters separated by less than 50 meters. They described a voice on the radio that never wavered, never rushed, calling corrections with the calm of someone reading a grocery list while the world burned. The squadron commander stood in front of the aircraft as the sun dropped toward the Hindu Kush. Colonel Vance Harrier had flown F-16s during Desert Storm and considered himself a connoisseur of tactical aviation. He'd never liked the A-10, considered it a relic, too slow and vulnerable for modern warfare. He'd certainly never understood pilots like Marlo, who volunteered for a platform that others saw as a career dead end. Now he stared at bullet holes that stitched across the fuselage in patterns that suggested multiple gun positions, at the hydraulic fluid still pooling beneath the wing, at that impossible flag standing in the cockpit. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the titanium skin, still warm from flight. The investigation began within hours, a timeline that suggested people at levels far above Bagram wanted answers immediately. The Defense Intelligence Agency sent a team. So did the Air Force Safety Center. Even the CIA dispatched an analyst, which raised questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. They pulled the aircraft's data recorder, expecting to find system failures or combat damage that explained the mystery. Instead, they found something that made the lead investigator, a lieutenant colonel with 20 years of accident analysis experience, request a secure line to the Pentagon. The A-10's autonomous flight systems had been manually activated 42 minutes before landing. Not automatically, as they would during pilot incapacitation, but deliberately, through a sequence of inputs that required intimate knowledge of emergency protocols most pilots never studied. The flight path showed calculated waypoints, altitude adjustments responding to terrain and air traffic, even a go-around when the initial approach to Bagram was blocked by a departing C-17. The aircraft had flown itself with a precision that suggested the pilot was still there, still making decisions, still fighting to bring her jet home. But the cockpit environmental systems told a different story. Cabin pressure had been lost 38 minutes before landing. Temperature had dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen flow had ceased. No human could have survived those conditions for more than 3 minutes, yet the aircraft continued receiving inputs, continued flying, continued executing a mission that had already killed its pilot. The data recorder's final entry showed one last manual input, the landing gear extension, executed at precisely the right altitude and airspeed for a textbook approach. Then nothing. Just autonomous systems following a flight plan someone had programmed while dying. The SEAL team lieutenant commander whose salute had started the vigil sat in the operations center, reading the preliminary report with the kind of focus that came from years of studying how men died. His name was Jack Reeves, and he'd worked with close air support pilots throughout his career. He'd called in Apache and Vipers, and even ancient B-52s during moments when his team needed God's own thunder. But he'd never experienced anything like Reaper 2-1's final mission. The Marines she'd saved had already transmitted their account, and Reeves had listened to the audio 3 times, trying to understand what he was hearing. The mission had started as a routine patrol, a rifle company moving through a valley that intelligence assessed as moderate threat. Then the world had collapsed. A company-sized enemy element had struck from 3 sides, positions carefully prepared, interlocking fields of fire that turned the valley into a kill box. The Marine Company commander had called for immediate close air support, his voice tight with the control of someone watching his Marines die. Reaper 2-1 had arrived 12 minutes later, her A-10 carrying a combat load of 30mm ammunition and 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles. The first words she spoke over the radio made the tactical air controller on the ground pause. Ghost 6, Reaper 2-1. I own this valley now. Mark your furthest position north with IR strobe. Anyone beyond that line belongs to me. There was no bravado in her voice, no Hollywood heroics, just a statement of fact delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. The tactical air controller, a sergeant named Marcus Webb who'd coordinated close air support for 4 years, later told investigators he'd felt something shift in the air when she spoke. The enemy had been pressing the Marine positions, their fire discipline and tactics suggesting professional fighters, maybe even Spetsnaz contractors advising Taliban forces. They'd been winning. Then Reaper 2-1 made her first gun run. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the A-10's nose was a weapon designed by people who understood that close air support meant danger close, that saving infantry lives required precision measured in feet rather than meters. 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, each 30mm round weighing nearly a pound, depleted uranium penetrators that could destroy armored vehicles and reduce fighting positions to pink mist. Marlowe Torrance had fired 1-second bursts, walking her rounds across enemy positions with adjustments so fine the Marines could hear individual bullets cracking overhead like supersonic whips. The first enemy machine gun position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater and silence. Then the second, then the third. She worked methodically, circling the valley in a left-hand pattern that kept her cannon oriented toward the enemy while maintaining visual contact with friendly positions. The tactical air controller updated her constantly, calling corrections that sometimes meant shifting her fire by less than 10 meters. She never questioned, never hesitated, never missed. 15 minutes into the engagement, the enemy tried to maneuver, attempting to flank the Marines from a wadi that offered concealment from aerial observation. Marlowe saw them anyway, adjusting her approach angle to fire down the length of the ravine, her cannon turning the wadi into an abattoir. The Marine Company commander, Captain Brian Moss, would later write in his after-action report that he'd witnessed combat aviation throughout his career, but had never seen anything approaching the lethal artistry of Reaper 2-1's gun runs. She wasn't just destroying enemy positions. She was reading the battle, anticipating enemy movements, closing avenues of approach before the enemy could exploit them. She was thinking 3 steps ahead while flying an aircraft that demanded absolute attention, managing weapons systems and radios and flight controls while processing a tactical picture that most pilots would have found overwhelming. Then her voice changed. Not dramatically, not with panic or fear, but with a subtle tightness that the tactical air controller recognized immediately. Something had gone wrong. She keyed the radio, her words still measured and calm. Ghost 6, Reaper 2-1. I've taken damage. Hydraulic failure, flight controls compromised. I'm staying on station. The tactical air controller's response was immediate. Reaper 2-1, Ghost 6, understand damage, advise you return to base. We can hold. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds, filled with the sound of the A-10's turbofans and the distant crack of rifle fire. When Marlowe spoke again, her voice carried a quality that made every Marine on that frequency stop and listen. Negative, Ghost 6. You've got wounded who need extraction and an enemy force that will overrun your position if I leave. I didn't come this far to let Marines die because my jet has a scratch. The tactical air controller, Sergeant Webb, felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd worked with pilots who spoke about honor and duty, who made grand statements about never leaving a man behind. But Marlowe Torrance wasn't making speeches. She was stating a simple equation, her life measured against the lives of 43 Marines, and the mathematics were obvious. She continued her gun runs. The A-10's titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit had been designed to withstand 23mm anti-aircraft fire, but something had penetrated anyway, possibly a lucky shot from a heavy machine gun, possibly a fragment from a surface-to-air missile that had detonated close enough to send shrapnel through the aircraft's belly. Hydraulic fluid was streaming from the starboard wing, the flight control systems degrading with every passing minute. The A-10 was built to survive catastrophic damage, its redundant systems and armored components a tribute to the men who designed it with one purpose: bring the pilot home. But even the Warthog had limits. Marlowe was reaching them. She fired her last Maverick missile into an enemy mortar position that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to the Marine command post. The explosion silenced the mortars permanently. Then she made another gun run, her cannon now running low on ammunition, each burst calculated to maximum effect. The enemy force was breaking, their coordinated assault fragmenting into individual fighters seeking escape routes. Marlowe hunted them methodically, her damaged A-10 responding to controls with increasing sluggishness, the hydraulic pressure dropping toward levels that would make flight impossible. Captain Moss watched from the ground, his binoculars tracking the gray aircraft as it circled overhead trailing smoke and fluid. He'd called for her to disengage 3 times. She'd ignored him 3 times. The medevac helicopters were inbound now, Black Hawks escorted by Apache gunships, responding to a call that had gone out 20 minutes earlier. They needed 5 minutes of security, 5 minutes when the enemy couldn't engage the vulnerable helicopters during landing and extraction. Marlowe gave them 10. Her final gun run took her across the valley at an altitude that made Sergeant Webb close his eyes and pray. She was below 100 feet, terrain masked behind a ridgeline, then popping up to fire down into enemy positions that had tried to regroup near a cluster of buildings. The GAU-8 roared, its distinctive sound like a giant zipper being pulled, and the buildings collapsed into rubble and dust. Then her voice came over the radio one last time, and every Marine listening would remember the words until their own dying days. Ghost 6, Reaper 2-1. Winchester on gun. Enemy is combat ineffective. Medevac is clear for approach. It's been an honor flying for Marines. The tactical air controller tried to respond, tried to thank her, tried to beg her to head home while she still could. But Reaper 2-1's transmission had already ended. The A-10 climbed slowly, painfully, gaining altitude with the labored effort of a wounded animal seeking a place to die. Captain Moss watched it disappear into the afternoon haze, its twin turbofans leaving contrails that looked like farewell waves. The medevac helicopters landed 3 minutes later, extracted the wounded under covering fire from the Apache, and departed without taking a single round of enemy fire. The Taliban fighters who remained alive had retreated into the mountains, their appetite for combat thoroughly extinguished by the gray demon that had circled above them. The final count would show 43 Marines saved, 0 friendly casualties during the extraction, and an enemy force estimated at company strength reduced to scattered survivors who would tell stories about the angel of death that flew too low and hit too hard. Back at Bagram, the investigation team was discovering details that deepened the mystery rather than solved it. The A-10's damage was catastrophic. In addition to the hydraulic failure, the aircraft had sustained hits to its port engine, damage to the tail section, and a round that had penetrated the cockpit, passing within inches of where the pilot's head would have been. The environmental control system had been destroyed by shrapnel, explaining the loss of cabin pressure and oxygen. But the timeline didn't make sense. The damage had occurred during Marlowe's first gun run, 38 minutes before the aircraft landed at Bagram. She'd flown damaged for the entire engagement, knowing she was dying, knowing the cold and oxygen deprivation would kill her long before she could reach base. Yet she'd stayed on station, continued fighting, executed gun runs that required precision and focus that most pilots couldn't maintain under ideal conditions. The flight surgeon who reviewed the data looked physically ill. Hypoxia at altitude combined with extreme cold would have rendered the pilot unconscious within minutes. Brain damage would have occurred within 5 minutes, death within 10. Yet the aircraft continued receiving manual inputs for 38 minutes, continued executing complex combat maneuvers, continued making decisions that saved lives on the ground. It was medically impossible. The SEAL Lieutenant Commander, Reeves, stood outside the hangar where they'd moved the damaged A-10, watching technicians photograph every bullet hole and document every system failure. He'd seen impossible things during his career, had witnessed human beings perform feats that defied explanation when their brothers' lives hung in the balance. But this was different. This suggested something beyond training or courage or even desperation. The squadron commander, Colonel Harrier, approached with a folder containing personnel records. His face showed an emotion Reeves had never seen from the man: shame. Inside the folder was Marlowe Torrance's complete service record, not the sanitized version that lived in the official files, but the real story compiled from fitness reports, squadron evaluations, and incident reports that painted a picture of a pilot who'd been systematically underestimated and undermined throughout her career. She'd graduated from the Air Force Academy in the bottom third of her class, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she'd spent her nights tutoring struggling classmates instead of competing for grades. Her flight training scores had been adequate but not exceptional, earning her an assignment to the A-10 when she'd requested fighters. The A-10 community was where the Air Force sent pilots who weren't quite good enough for the sexy jets. The F-15s, and F-16s that dominated aviation magazines and recruitment videos. Marlowe had taken the assignment without complaint and discovered something the fast jet pilots never understood. The A-10 wasn't about speed or beyond visual range missiles or dogfighting. It was about the grunt on the ground, the infantryman pinned down by enemy fire, the soldier who needed someone to care enough to fly low and slow and vulnerable because his life was worth the risk. She'd fallen in love with the mission, and the mission had made her into something the fighter pilots could never be: essential. Her first combat deployment to Iraq had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission that should have killed her. A Marine reconnaissance team had been ambushed in Ramadi, surrounded by insurgents who'd learned to mass forces quickly before air support could arrive. Marlowe had been the closest aircraft, diverted from a patrol mission, arriving over the contact area with a combat load and fury that the Marines later described as biblical. She'd made 16-gun runs over 90 minutes, expending all her ammunition and staying on station even after Winchester, directing other aircraft and coordinating fires with the calm of someone conducting a symphony. When she finally landed at Al-Assad Air Base, her A-10 had carried over 200 bullet holes, damage to both engines, and a hydraulic system that failed completely during taxi. The maintenance chief had told her the aircraft shouldn't have been flyable. She'd smiled and said the Marines were worth it. But the Distinguished Flying Cross hadn't translated into respect from her peers. The fighter pilots still saw her as a second-tier aviator flying a second-tier aircraft. The A-10 community loved her, but they were a small tribe within a service that worshipped speed and technology. Her fitness reports praised her combat skills but questioned her potential for leadership, using coded language that suggested she was too focused on tactics and not political enough for advancement. The evaluation that stung most had come from her own squadron commander during her second deployment, a man who wrote that Captain Torrance was an adequate pilot who lacked the vision for higher responsibility and should consider non-operational assignments. Marlowe had responded by requesting a third combat deployment and volunteering for every dangerous mission the squadron flew. She'd become known as the pilot who never said no, who took the night missions and the bad weather missions and the troops in contact calls that arrived during crew rest. Other pilots joked that she was trying to die gloriously because she couldn't succeed politically. They didn't understand that she'd already found her purpose, and it didn't involve promotion boards or staff jobs at the Pentagon. Colonel Harrier read through the records with mounting understanding of how badly he'd misjudged her. 3 weeks ago he'd called her into his office and suggested she consider an assignment to Air Combat Command Headquarters, framing it as a career opportunity when they both knew it was involuntary exile. He told her that her combat hours were making the squadron's younger pilots look bad, that she was taking too many risks, that the Air Force needed staff officers as much as trigger pullers. Marlowe had sat across from him with the same calm expression she wore in the cockpit and asked a single question. "Sir, am I being grounded for mission failure or safety violations?" He'd admitted she had neither. Her response had been delivered without anger or emotion. "Then with respect, sir, I'll continue flying combat missions until I'm no longer qualified or the war no longer needs pilots who care about the infantrymen. I didn't join the Air Force to push papers at headquarters while Marines die because there weren't enough A-10s overhead." Harrier had let her continue flying, more from inability to produce a valid reason to ground her than from respect for her dedication. Now he stood in front of her destroyed aircraft and understood with crystalline clarity that Marlowe Torrance had been the best pilot in his squadron, possibly the best pilot he'd ever commanded, and he'd been too blind to see it because she didn't fit the profile of what he thought excellence looked like. The investigation reached a conclusion that satisfied no one. The official report stated that Captain Marlowe Torrance had died in combat performing close air support for Marines in contact. The aircraft had been catastrophically damaged during the engagement, resulting in environmental system failure that caused pilot incapacitation. The autonomous flight systems had activated and returned the aircraft to base, a testament to modern engineering and redundant safety systems. The report was technically accurate and completely dishonest. Everyone who read the data, who listened to the radio transmissions, who understood the timeline, knew the truth was more complex and more troubling. Marlo Torrance had died saving Marines, but she'd done it while conscious, while making decisions, while flying an aircraft that should have been unflyable by a pilot who should have been dead. The how didn't matter anymore. Only the why mattered, and the why was written across every action she'd taken during her career. She'd cared more about others than herself, had valued the infantryman's life above her own comfort or safety or advancement, had found meaning in service that transcended rank or recognition. The memorial service was held at Bagram 3 days later, a ceremony attended by the entire squadron, the Marine Rifle Company she'd saved, the SEAL team that had rendered honors, and a collection of officers and enlisted personnel who'd heard the story and needed to pay respects. They'd mounted the small American flag that had been found in her cockpit onto a plaque beneath her name and call sign. The squadron commander who'd questioned her dedication read her citation aloud with a voice that broke twice, and when he finished, the Marine Company commander approached the memorial and added his own tribute. A combat action ribbon removed from his own uniform, placed beside the flag. Then Sergeant Webb, the tactical air controller, approached and added his air controller qualification badge. One by one, Marines and airmen and special operations personnel added items to the memorial: unit patches, qualification badges, personal challenge coins, each one a small declaration that Reaper 21 had mattered, that her sacrifice had meaning, that she deserved better than the official report's sanitized version of events. The SEAL Lieutenant Commander, Reeves, was the last to approach. He removed his trident from his uniform, the golden symbol that represented years of suffering through selection and training, that marked him as part of a brotherhood that accepted only the exceptional. He placed it beside the flag and came to attention, rendering a salute that the entire assembly mirrored. In that moment, at Bagram Airfield in eastern Afghanistan, while the sun set over mountains that had witnessed countless wars and forgotten more heroes than history would ever record, Marlo Torrance received the recognition that had eluded her in life. But recognition wasn't why she'd flown her final mission. Understanding that required understanding something about pilots like Marlo, about warriors who found their purpose not in glory, but in the simple act of standing between danger and those who needed protection. The Air Force promoted captains to major through a board process that valued career progression, educational credentials, and leadership potential, as defined by staff officers who'd never heard bullets crack overhead. Marlo Torrance would never face that board now, would never wear Major's oak leaves, would never command a squadron or serve on a staff. But 43 Marines went home to their families because she decided their lives mattered more than her own survival. And in the calculus of combat where meaning is measured in blood and sacrifice, she'd achieved a rank that no promotion board could bestow. The weeks that followed brought a tension that made the Air Force uncomfortable. The Marines whom Marlo had saved refused to let her story disappear into classified files and redacted reports. Captain Moss wrote a detailed recommendation for the Medal of Honor, documenting every action she'd taken, every impossible decision she'd made while dying. The recommendation traveled up the chain of command, gathering endorsements from generals who understood that heroism sometimes wore the face of a pilot others had considered mediocre. But the Medal of Honor required witnesses who could testify to actions beyond the call of duty. The Marines could testify to the results of her gun runs, to the accuracy and courage of her attack. They couldn't testify to what happened in that cockpit, couldn't explain how she'd continued fighting while her body shut down from hypoxia and cold. The Air Force compromised, awarding Marlo the Air Force Cross posthumously, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The ceremony was held at a different location now, not at Bagram but at Dover Air Force Base, where her remains had been returned after recovery teams had finally found what was left. The recovery had taken 3 weeks of searching a region where the aircraft should never have been, where the flight path suggested impossible detours and unexplained course changes. They'd found her 5 miles from the Coringal Valley, in a narrow canyon that offered no tactical value and no connection to her mission. She was sitting against a rock face, her flight suit torn and bloody, her survival radio clutched in one hand. The radio's battery was dead, but technicians who examined it later found evidence that it had transmitted for hours after she'd ejected from the dying A-10, sending a signal that nobody had heard because she'd been transmitting on a frequency that hadn't been used since her Iraq deployment. She'd been calling for someone named Jamie, asking if they were okay, apologizing for being late. The investigation into her final hours revealed details that transformed the mystery into something approaching tragedy. Marlowe had ejected from the A-10 47 minutes before it landed at Bagram, using the last of her strength to activate the autonomous systems and point the aircraft home before pulling the handles. The ejection had been clean, her parachute deploying properly, bringing her down in terrain that offered survival if she could reach a rally point and signal for extraction. But she'd been critically injured during the ejection sequence, possibly from shrapnel wounds sustained during the earlier engagement, possibly from hitting the tail section during separation from the aircraft. She'd landed, deployed her survival radio, and begun transmitting, not for rescue, for Jamie. The personnel investigation that followed uncovered what the official files had missed, what Marlowe had kept private throughout her career, because the military in 2025 was better than it had been but still not safe for certain truths. Jamie had been Captain Marlowe's wingman during the Ramadi deployment, a pilot named Jamie Carrick who'd flown as Reaper 22, who'd been more than a fellow aviator in ways that Marlowe had never documented in official communications or personal journals that investigators could find. They'd flown together for 6 months, developing the kind of tactical synchronization that made them devastating as a team. Then Jamie's A-10 had been hit during a close air support mission, damage to the flight controls that resulted in an unrecoverable spin and an ejection over hostile territory. Marlowe had stayed overhead for 14 hours, refusing to leave, directing the search and rescue effort with the intensity of someone fighting death itself. They'd found Jamie 3 days later, killed not by the ejection, but by insurgents who'd captured and executed their prisoner. Marlowe had flown the mission to recover Jamie's remains, had watched as they loaded the flag-draped transfer case onto a C-17, had rendered honors with a face that showed nothing and eyes that showed everything. She'd requested and received permission to serve as the escort officer for Jamie's remains, flying commercial back to the United States, staying with the transfer case through every connection, ensuring Jamie didn't travel alone. The funeral had been held in a small town in Montana, attended by family who'd known Jamie was Air Force, but had never understood what that meant, what their child had done, or who their child had loved. Marlowe had stood in uniform at the graveside, accepted the folded flag from the honor guard, and presented it to Jamie's mother with words that were protocol and ritual and utterly inadequate for the moment. She'd returned to her squadron after 2 weeks of emergency leave, filed the required paperwork documenting her presence at the funeral, and requested immediate return to combat status. The squadron commander at the time had been a different officer, a man who'd looked at her with concern and suggested she take more time. Marlowe had declined, saying the best way to honor Jamie's memory was to continue the mission they'd started together. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody had asked why a wingman's death affected her so deeply. Nobody had understood that they weren't witnessing grief between squadron mates, but the aftermath of a love that military culture still couldn't fully accommodate, even in a service that had officially embraced diversity. Marlowe had carried that loss through 2 more combat deployments, through hundreds of missions, through every gun run where she'd valued the infantryman's life above her own safety. She'd been chasing something during those missions, maybe redemption, maybe purpose, maybe just a way to make Jamie's death mean something by ensuring no other pilot's wingman died alone and unavenged. In that canyon in Afghanistan, bleeding from wounds that would have killed most people within minutes, Marlowe's final thoughts hadn't been about the Marines she'd saved or the combat record she'd compiled. They'd been about Jamie, about a promise she'd made at a graveside in Montana that she would continue the mission, that she would honor the sacrifice by never leaving another soldier or Marine to die when she had ammunition and fuel and the ability to fight. The survival radio's dead battery had preserved her final transmissions, recorded in solid-state memory that didn't require power to maintain. The technicians who extracted and reviewed the data did so in a secure facility, creating transcripts that were immediately classified because they revealed more about Captain Marlowe Torrance than the Air Force wanted in official records. The transmissions were fragmented, confused by blood loss and hypoxia, but certain phrases repeated. "I got them home, Jamie. I got all of them home. The Marines are safe. I stayed until they were safe. Just like I promised. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry I have to go. I'm sorry I'm late. I'll see you soon. I love you. I'm sorry." The recovery team leader who'd found her body, a pararescueman named Elias Grant, had seen death in enough forms to recognize peace when he encountered it. Marlowe had died alone in a canyon 5 miles from the nearest friendly position, but her face had held an expression of calm completion. She'd finished her mission. She'd kept her promise. She'd honored Jamie's memory by saving 43 lives at the cost of her own. Whatever judgment waited beyond death, she'd faced it with the confidence of someone who'd measured their life in service and found the balance acceptable. The Air Force Cross ceremony was conducted with full military honors at Dover, but the memorial service that mattered happened 3,000 miles away in Montana, at a cemetery where Captain Jamie Carrick had been buried 8 years earlier. Marlowe's family, what little remained after parents who'd passed and siblings scattered across the country, had granted permission for burial beside Jamie despite not fully understanding the connection. The squadron made the pilgrimage, along with the Marines whom Marlowe had saved, their presence a statement that transcended policy and protocol. They buried Reaper 2-1 beside Reaper 2-2, 2 headstones in a quiet cemetery that would never draw tourists or become a destination for military history enthusiasts. Just 2 pilots who'd loved their mission and each other, who'd given everything to a service that had taken their sacrifice while questioning their worth. The Marine Company commander, Captain Moss, stood at the graveside after the formal ceremony ended, after the rifles had fired their salute and the bugler had played taps and the honor guard had folded the flag with mechanical precision. He was alone except for the squadron commander, Colonel Harrier, who'd remained behind while others returned to the reception. Moss spoke quietly, addressing the headstone as if Marlowe could hear. "I want you to know something, Captain. Your squadron commander here has been beating himself up for 3 weeks about how he treated you. He thinks he failed you, that he should have recognized your value before you died proving it. I told him he's wrong. You didn't fly that final mission for recognition. You didn't stay on station because you needed validation from superior officers. You did it because 43 Marines needed you, and that was enough. That was always enough." Colonel Harrier said nothing, but his expression showed agreement with Moss's assessment. They stood in silence for several minutes, 2 officers contemplating sacrifice and value and the gap between what institutions claim to honor and what they actually reward. Finally, Harrier spoke, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept contained throughout the official ceremonies. "I'm changing how this squadron evaluates pilots. From now on, the measure of excellence isn't flight hours or safety metrics or how well someone navigates office politics. It's this: would the infantrymen want them overhead when the world goes to hell? Would they stay on station when their fuel gauge reads empty and their aircraft is dying? Do they care more about others than themselves?" He paused, then added, "Marlowe exemplified that standard. I was too stupid to see it. I won't make that mistake again." The changes Colonel Harrier implemented rippled through the A-10 community and beyond. He created an award, unofficial and unrecognized by Air Force regulation, called the Reaper 21 Excellence in Close Air Support Award. It wasn't a medal or a trophy. It was a challenge coin bearing Marlowe's call sign and a simple inscription, "For the infantrymen." He gave the coin to pilots who exemplified the standard Marlowe had set, who flew missions that valued the soldier's life above personal safety, who understood that close air support wasn't about accumulating flight hours, but about standing between danger and those who needed protection. The coin became more valued within the community than official decorations, a mark of respect that came from peers who understood the mission, rather than bureaucrats who evaluated records. Other squadrons adopted similar standards, creating their own versions of the award, each one a small rebellion against a system that too often confused careerism with competence. The SEAL Lieutenant Commander, Reeves, took a different approach to honoring Marlowe's memory. He began including her story in the briefings he gave to new SEAL team members during their close air support training, using her final mission as a case study in what right looked like. He showed them the radio transcripts, explained the tactical decisions she'd made, walked them through the timeline that proved she'd been dying while saving their brothers. Then he'd pause the briefing and ask a question. What does this teach us about the people who support us? The young SEALs, accustomed to viewing themselves as the tip of the spear, the elite warriors who operated beyond normal limits, would struggle with the answer. Reeves would let them work through it, then provide his own conclusion. It teaches us that excellence exists throughout the military, not just in special operations. It teaches us that the person flying overhead might care about your life more than their own advancement. It teaches us humility, because that A-10 pilot you think is just a taxi service might be the person who saves your life by making decisions you'll never see and sacrifices you'll never know. Treat them accordingly. Honor them accordingly, because the next Reaper 21 might be the voice on the radio when your world goes to hell. The briefings had impact. SEAL teams began treating their air support differently, developing relationships with pilots before deployments, learning call signs and building trust that went beyond tactical radio communications. The cultural shift was subtle but real, a recognition that valor wore many uniforms and flew many different aircraft. At Bagram, the damaged A-10 that Marlowe had brought home became something approaching a shrine. The Air Force wanted to repair it, return it to service as regulations required. The maintenance crews refused. They'd formed a protective wall around the aircraft, refusing to sign off on repairs or release it for depot maintenance. The squadron commander supported them, finding bureaucratic loopholes that delayed the inevitable. The aircraft sat in a hangar with its battle damage preserved, each bullet hole and hydraulic leak a testament to what Marlowe had survived and overcome. Pilots would visit before missions, touching the titanium skin for luck, reading the story written in torn metal and bloodstains that maintenance had deliberately not cleaned away. It became tradition for new A-10 pilots to spend time with the aircraft, learning about Reaper 21 and the standards she'd set, understanding that their mission wasn't about flying fast or employing exotic weapons, but about caring enough to fly slow and vulnerable because someone on the ground needed them. The tradition spread to other A-10 squadrons, the story passing through the community like sacred text, each retelling adding emphasis to different aspects but maintaining the core truth. Marlowe Torrance had been the best of them, and they'd failed to recognize it until after she was gone. The 43 Marines whom Marlowe saved carried their own burden of remembrance. They'd survived because someone they'd never met had valued their lives above her own. That knowledge changed them in ways both subtle and profound. Several re-enlisted specifically to honor her sacrifice, deciding that if someone had cared that much about their survival, they owed it to her memory to be worth that sacrifice. They carried photos of Marlowe in their gear, printed from the official memorial service programs, her face serious and competent beneath her flight helmet. They told stories about Reaper 21 to other Marines, ensuring that her legend spread beyond the A-10 community, that infantrymen understood what close air support meant when done right. One Marine, a lance corporal named David Ochoa, who'd been carrying a wounded comrade when Marlowe's final gun run had eliminated the enemy fighters pursuing them, started a foundation to support families of fallen pilots. He named it the Reaper 21 Foundation, its mission to ensure that pilots who died in combat supporting ground forces were remembered beyond their official service records. The foundation provided scholarships to pilots' children, supported surviving spouses, and maintained a memorial website that told stories the official history often missed. Ochoa's efforts attracted attention from other veterans who'd been saved by close air support pilots, creating a network of remembrance that transcended service branches and eras. They held annual reunions where pilots and infantrymen shared stories, where the voice on the radio met the soldier on the ground, where both sides of the close air support relationship could acknowledge the bonds formed in combat. At the third reunion, they unveiled a memorial wall listing every close air support pilot who died in combat since Vietnam. Marlowe's name was there, third from the top, her call sign and date of death engraved in granite that would outlast memory. The ceremony attracted media attention, something the organizers hadn't anticipated and didn't particularly want. News outlets ran stories about the mysterious pilot who'd brought her aircraft home empty, about the SEALs who'd saluted an abandoned cockpit, about the Marines who'd been saved by a pilot others had underestimated. The stories were generally accurate but missed the deeper truth, framing Marlowe's final mission as a mystery to be solved rather than a statement of values to be understood. Some reporters focused on the impossible timeline, treating her survival and continued combat effectiveness as a puzzle that required medical or technical explanation. Others emphasized the tragedy, the waste of a life lost to war, the sadness of her death in a distant canyon. None of them understood that Marlowe would have rejected their sympathy, that she'd made a choice with full knowledge of the consequences, that her death wasn't a tragedy, but a culmination of a life lived according to principles most people claimed to value but few demonstrated when the cost became real. The Air Force's initial discomfort with the media attention gradually shifted to grudging pride as the service recognized that Marlowe's story reflected well on the institution, even if individual leaders had failed her. The Chief of Staff mentioned her during congressional testimony about the value of the A-10 in modern warfare, using her final mission as evidence that the platform remained relevant. The Air Force Academy added her story to their curriculum, teaching cadets about tactical decision-making under extreme circumstances, about leadership that didn't require recognition or rank, about the difference between courage and recklessness. But the most meaningful recognition came from a source Marlowe never could have anticipated: the Taliban fighters who'd survived her final mission. Intelligence agencies intercepted communications between enemy units discussing the attack, analyzing what had gone wrong, trying to understand how a small Marine force had repelled a much larger element that should have achieved overwhelming victory. The recordings, translated and transcribed, revealed a grudging respect for the pilot they'd encountered, the aircraft that had circled overhead dealing death with precision they'd never experienced. One fighter, a commander whose voice analysts identified as belonging to an experienced leader, described the engagement in terms that intelligence officers found remarkable. "We fought the gray demon today, the one that sounds like death and flies close enough to touch. We had everything: numbers, position, weapons. But the demon had something we couldn't match: a pilot who would not leave, who would not miss, who cared more about the Americans below than her own survival. We killed her, tore her flying machine to pieces, but she kept fighting. Even dying, she fought. Even dead, she won. Allah grant us never to face another like her." The intercept was classified immediately, deemed too sensitive for public release, but copies circulated through the intelligence community and eventually reached the Marines whom Marlowe had saved. They read the translation with mixed emotions: pride that their enemy recognized Reaper 21's skill, sorrow that recognition had come too late, anger that it had required her death to prove her worth. Captain Moss, the Marine Company commander, requested and received permission to share the intercept with Marlowe's squadron. He traveled back to Bagram 6 months after her death, carrying the translation in a sealed envelope, and presented it to Colonel Harrier during a ceremony where the squadron formally dedicated their operations center to her memory. Harrier read the translation aloud, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. When he finished, the assembled pilots sat in silence, processing the reality that their enemy had recognized Marlowe's excellence before many of her own peers had. The silence stretched until a young lieutenant, newly assigned to the squadron and hungry to prove himself, spoke up. "Sir, how do we ensure we're worthy of her standard? How do we become pilots that the enemy respects and the infantryman trusts?" Harrier's response became squadron lore, repeated to every new pilot who joined. "You fly every mission like it's your last. You value every soldier's life like it's your brother's. You make decisions based on what's right, not what's safe. And most importantly, you never ask whether the infantryman is worth the risk. You assume he is, and you act accordingly. That's what Marlowe did. That's what Reaper 2-1 means." The young lieutenant, whose name was Marcus Trent, took the words seriously enough to change his approach to flying. He volunteered for the difficult missions, studied close air support tactics with religious intensity, and built relationships with ground controllers that made him effective in ways raw flying skill never could. 3 years later, during a mission in Syria, he'd make decisions that echoed Marlowe's, staying on station despite catastrophic damage to save a surrounded special operations team. He survived his mission, landing with an aircraft that maintenance declared unflyable, and when asked about his actions, he simply said, "I learned from Reaper 2-1." His story would become another data point in the pattern, evidence that Marlowe's example had transcended her death, that her standard had become embedded in the culture of pilots who flew the A-10. The pattern repeated across the community as pilots who'd studied her final mission went on to their own combat experiences, carrying her lessons into situations where those lessons meant the difference between success and failure, between lives saved and lives lost. The institutional impact was harder to measure, but no less real. The Air Force began evaluating close air support missions differently, focusing less on flight hours and munitions expended and more on the outcomes for ground forces. They created new metrics for measuring pilot effectiveness that included feedback from the soldiers and Marines who'd received support, essentially democratizing the assessment process to include the people whose lives depended on tactical aviation. The changes were bureaucratic and incremental, fought over by competing visions of what the service valued, but they moved in a direction that Marlowe would have recognized, toward a standard that measured worth by mission accomplishment rather than career advancement. 8 years after Marlowe's death, the Marine Corps dedicated a new building at their Close Air Support Training Center in Yuma, Arizona. They named it Torrance Hall, placing a bronze plaque in the lobby that told her story in language that emphasized action over sentiment. The building housed classrooms where Marines learned to coordinate air support, simulators where they practiced calling corrections under stress, and a small museum displaying artifacts from close air support missions throughout Marine Corps history. In that museum, in a place of honor, they mounted the original flag that had been found in Marlowe's cockpit, the small piece of fabric that had survived her final mission to become a symbol of sacrifice and dedication. Beside the flag, they placed the Tactical Air Controller qualification badge that Sergeant Webb had left at her memorial, and the sealed trident that Lieutenant Commander Reeves had contributed. Over the years, other items accumulated. Challenge coins from squadrons she'd supported, unit patches from Marine companies she'd saved, even a fragment of titanium bathtub from her destroyed A-10, recovered during the aircraft's eventual decommissioning and donated by maintenance personnel who'd refused to let any piece of her jet be treated as ordinary scrap. The museum became a pilgrimage site for Marines learning close air support, a place where they confronted the reality that the voice on the radio might be the last thing between them and death, that the person flying overhead might care about their survival more than anything else in the world. Instructors would bring classes to stand before Marlowe's memorial and ask them to consider a question. What do you owe to a pilot who would make these choices? How do you honor that sacrifice? What responsibility comes with knowing someone might die to save you? The questions weren't rhetorical. The Marines were expected to develop answers, to think seriously about the relationship between air and ground forces, to understand that effective close air support required mutual respect and trust that extended beyond tactical radio procedures. The best students understood that Marlowe's story wasn't unique, that there were dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of pilots who'd made similar choices in smaller engagements that never generated news coverage or official investigations. Marlowe had become famous because her final mission was so extreme, so impossible, so perfectly emblematic of a particular kind of warrior. But she represented a tradition, a standard that existed before her and continued after her, maintained by pilots whose names would never appear in museums, but who flew every mission according to the same principles. The A-10 community, always a tight brotherhood within the larger Air Force, adopted Marlowe as their patron saint, the perfect embodiment of what the platform represented. At the annual A-10 reunion, where veteran pilots gathered to tell stories and remember fallen friends, they began each evening with a toast to Reaper 2-1, a moment of silence that acknowledged the debt they owed to her example. The ritual was simple but powerful, a single-shot glass placed on a table draped with an American flag, filled with whiskey and left untouched throughout the evening. Beside the glass, a card bearing Marlowe's call sign and the inscription, "For the infantrymen." Pilots would approach the table individually throughout the evening, pausing to remember not just Marlowe, but all the pilots who'd made similar choices, who'd valued the mission above safety, who'd understood that the A-10's purpose wasn't to survive, but to ensure others survived. The younger pilots would ask the veterans what Marlowe had been like, seeking personal details that might explain her choices. But none of the veterans had known her well. The A-10 community was large enough that pilots in different squadrons rarely interacted except at formal occasions. The portrait they painted was assembled from official records, from the few interviews she'd given to combat historians, from the stories of Marines and soldiers who'd received her support. She emerged from these accounts as someone intensely private, professionally competent, personally driven by motivations she never fully explained. She didn't drink with the squadron, didn't participate in the social events that built camaraderie. She spent her free time studying tactics, reviewing gun camera footage from other pilots' missions, teaching younger aviators techniques for reading ground combat and anticipating friendly force needs. Some pilots found her intensity off-putting, mistaking dedication for arrogance or antisocial behavior. Others recognized her as someone who'd found meaning in the mission and needed nothing else to feel complete. She'd been, in many ways, unknowable, her inner life a mystery that died with her in that Afghan canyon. But her actions spoke clearly enough, painting a portrait of values that needed no explanation. 10 years after her death, the Air Force finally retired the A-10 from combat operations, a decision driven by budget constraints and changing priorities rather than combat effectiveness. The announcement generated protests from veterans who'd relied on the platform, from pilots who loved the mission, from Marines who understood that no other aircraft could replicate the A-10's unique combination of firepower, survivability, and loiter time. The protests delayed but couldn't prevent the inevitable. The final combat mission was flown by a pilot who'd entered the A-10 community specifically because of Marlowe's example, a captain named Sarah Vance, who'd written her academy thesis on the tactical and ethical dimensions of close air support. She'd studied every aspect of Marlowe's final mission, interviewed the Marines who'd survived, spent hours reviewing the classified data that documented the impossible timeline. Her mission was routine by comparison, a show of force flight over a region where coalition forces were withdrawing, more symbolic than tactical. But she flew it with the intensity of someone honoring a tradition, carrying with her a photo of Marlowe in the cockpit, visible on the instrument panel where the original flag had stood. When she landed at Bagram for the final time, completing the last A-10 combat mission, she placed the photo on the memorial that still existed in the hangar where Marlowe's damaged aircraft had been stored. The gesture was small, personal, but it represented something larger: the passing of a standard from one generation to the next, the acknowledgement that excellence in military aviation wasn't about technology or speed, but about the human decision to care, to serve, to sacrifice when necessary. The retirement ceremony was attended by senior Air Force leadership, by veterans who'd flown the A-10 since its introduction in the 1970s, by infantrymen who'd been saved by the platform throughout decades of conflict. But the person everyone wanted present couldn't attend. Marlo Torrance existed only in memory now, her body buried in Montana beside Jamie Carrick, her story preserved in official records and unofficial legends. The ceremony's keynote speaker, a retired four-star general who'd commanded Air Combat Command, used his address to acknowledge institutional failures. We created metrics that measured everything except what mattered. We promoted pilots based on career trajectory rather than combat effectiveness. We confused bureaucratic competence with tactical excellence. And in doing so, we sometimes failed to recognize our best people until after they were gone. Captain Torrance was not a perfect officer by our traditional standards. She didn't navigate politics well. She didn't pursue advancement aggressively. She didn't fit the profile we associated with high potential. But she was exactly what we needed and exactly what we should have valued. A warrior who understood that our purpose is to serve those who cannot serve themselves, who fight so others can live, who measure success not in promotions earned but in lives saved. We owe her an apology we can never deliver and a debt we can never fully repay. But we can ensure that her example shapes how we evaluate excellence, how we identify and develop our future leaders, how we maintain a culture that rewards what matters rather than what's convenient to measure. That is her legacy, and it's the least we can offer in return for what she gave. The speech received a standing ovation, but the more meaningful response came later, during the informal reception, when multiple officers approached with stories of changes they'd implemented in their own commands, inspired directly by Marlowe's example. A wing commander described new evaluation criteria emphasizing mission accomplishment over administrative efficiency. A training squadron commander explained how they'd restructured their syllabus to emphasize tactical decision-making and ethical considerations. An academy instructor detailed changes to the core curriculum that used case studies, including Marlowe's final mission, to teach cadets about leadership under extreme circumstances. The changes were scattered, inconsistent, dependent on individual commanders rather than institutional mandate. But they represented a shift, an acknowledgement that the traditional model might need adjustment, that warriors like Marlowe deserved recognition within the system rather than only after their deaths. The museum at Yuma added new exhibits over the years, chronicling the evolution of close air support and highlighting pilots who'd exemplified excellence in the mission. Marlowe's memorial remained the centerpiece, but it was joined by others: pilots who died in Vietnam providing support to surrounded infantry, aviators who'd sacrificed in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. Each story unique in its details, each sharing common themes of courage, dedication, and the willingness to prioritize others above self. School groups visiting the museum would stop at Marlowe's memorial, children too young to understand war staring at the flag and the medals and the photo of a serious woman in a flight suit. Teachers would explain that she was a hero, that she'd saved people, that she'd shown courage. The children would ask questions. Was she scared? Did it hurt? Why did she do it? The teachers would struggle with answers, eventually settling on simplified versions that emphasized service and sacrifice, without dwelling on the darker implications of combat death. But some children, the ones who'd grow up to join the military themselves, would remember the story and carry it into their own service. They'd recall standing in front of that memorial, feeling something they couldn't articulate, sensing that heroism was more complex and more costly than the sanitized versions presented in classrooms. And when they faced their own moments of decision, their own calculations of risk versus duty, some would remember Reaper 2-1 and the standard she'd set. 15 years after Marlowe's death, the Marine Rifle Company she'd saved held their own reunion, the first in years that included all surviving members. They gathered in Montana, at the cemetery where Marlowe and Jamie were buried, to pay respects and remember what they owed. The Marines were older now, many retired from service, carrying injuries both visible and hidden from deployments that had continued long after the Coringal Valley engagement. They stood at the gravesites and told stories, each one adding details to the collective memory of that day when the world had narrowed to survival, and a voice on the radio had promised them safety. Captain Moss, now a retired major who'd served 3 more deployments before leaving the Corps, spoke for the group. "We've spent 15 years trying to understand why you stayed. We've analyzed your decision from every angle, searched for rational explanations that might make sense of the choice you made. But I think we've been asking the wrong question. It's not why you stayed. It's how you knew with absolute certainty that staying was right. Most of us go through life making decisions based on incomplete information, hedging bets, playing percentages. You didn't have that luxury. You had minutes to decide whether 43 Marines you'd never met were worth your life. And you didn't hesitate. That clarity of purpose, that absolute confidence in your own values, that's what made you extraordinary. Not your flying skills, not your tactical abilities, but your moral certainty that saving us was worth any cost. We're grateful, we're humbled, and we're trying every day to live lives worthy of that sacrifice. Some of us are succeeding, some of us are struggling. But all of us carry you with us, a constant reminder of what it means to serve something larger than ourselves." The Marines held a private ceremony after the speeches, each one approaching the graves to leave tokens of remembrance. Unit patches, challenge coins, photos of children who existed because their fathers had survived the Coringal Valley. Lance Corporal Ochoa, whose foundation had grown into a significant force supporting fallen pilots' families, left a check for a scholarship program he'd established in Marlowe's name. It would fund flight training for qualified students, with preference given to candidates who demonstrated commitment to service rather than just aptitude for flying. The scholarship's mission statement captured what Ochoa had learned from Marlowe's example. Excellence in aviation is measured not by individual achievement, but by willingness to employ skill for others' benefit, to accept risk for others' safety, to value service above recognition. The first scholarship recipient, a young woman from Alabama who'd grown up reading about Marlowe's final mission, would go on to become an A-10 pilot herself, flying combat missions in new conflicts that emerged after the Afghanistan withdrawal. She'd carry forward the tradition, mentoring younger pilots with lessons learned from a person she'd never met but whose example had shaped her understanding of what it meant to wear a uniform. 20 years after Marlowe's death, the Air Force reintroduced the A-10 to limited combat service, a decision driven by recognition that certain missions still required the platform's unique capabilities. The new generation A-10s carried upgraded avionics and weapon systems, but the fundamental platform remained unchanged. Twin engines, titanium bathtub, GAU-8 cannon, designed to fly low and slow and absorb damage while keeping the pilot alive. The first squadron to receive the reactivated aircraft held a ceremony christening their lead aircraft, the Spirit of Reaper 2-1, painting Marlowe's call sign beneath the cockpit alongside a small representation of the flag that had made it home. The gesture was symbolic but meaningful, a statement that the platform's return wasn't just about tactical capability, but about maintaining a tradition of service that Marlowe embodied. Pilots assigned to the new squadron studied her final mission as part of their qualification training, examining the decisions she'd made, the tactics she'd employed, the sacrifice she'd rendered. They learned to measure their own performance against her standard, understanding that technical proficiency was necessary but insufficient, that excellence required moral clarity and willingness to prioritize the mission above personal survival. The reintroduction generated renewed media interest in Marlowe's story, documentaries that attempted to tell her tale for new audiences who'd been children when she died. The documentaries were well-produced and respectful, interviewing surviving Marines, showing footage of the A-10 platform, explaining the tactical situation she'd faced. But they struggled to capture the essence of what made her story meaningful, reducing complex moral calculations to simple hero narratives that felt incomplete. The Marines who'd been there watched the documentaries with mixed emotions, grateful for recognition, but frustrated by oversimplification. They understood that Marlowe's choice couldn't be adequately explained in an hour-long program, that the decision to stay on station, while dying, required context most viewers would never possess. The knowledge of what it meant to be surrounded by enemies, the understanding that extraction under fire was nearly impossible, the certainty that without air support they would die slowly and violently in a distant valley. Marlowe had understood that context instantly, processing information that would have overwhelmed most people, making a decision that saved 43 lives while ending her own. The documentaries mentioned her death, showed her grave, interviewed tearful Marines who described what they owed her. But they couldn't convey the weight of that debt, couldn't explain what it meant to live with the knowledge that your continued existence came at the price of someone else's sacrifice. Some of the Marines struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they deserved saving, whether they'd lived lives worthy of Marlowe's choice. Others channeled their gratitude into action, creating meaning through service and dedication that honored her memory by demonstrating that her sacrifice hadn't been wasted. The best of them understood that Marlowe hadn't saved them because they deserved it, but because she'd valued all human life above her own, that her choice reflected her character rather than their worth. That understanding freed them from impossible debt, allowing them to live fully while remembering gratefully. The Secretary of Defense, reviewing defense policy 25 years after Marlowe's death, used her story during congressional testimony about the value of specialized platforms in modern warfare. He argued that technology alone couldn't replace human judgment, that certain missions required pilots willing to accept risk on behalf of ground forces, that the military needed to maintain cultural values that encouraged such sacrifice. The testimony was pragmatic, focused on budget and capability and strategic requirements. But it acknowledged, perhaps inadvertently, that warriors like Marlowe were force multipliers beyond any technical metric, that their example inspired others to excellence in ways no training program could replicate. Congress approved funding for the A-10 program extension, influenced partially by the testimony, but more significantly by pressure from veterans groups who'd mobilized around the platform's symbolic value. The decision was announced on the anniversary of Marlowe's final mission, a coincidence that felt deliberate even if unplanned. At ceremonies held at multiple locations, Bagram, Yuma, Dover, Montana, people gathered to remember and honor the pilot who demonstrated what the platform could achieve when flown by someone who truly understood the mission. The ceremonies included speeches and honors and the reading of Marlowe's citation for the Air Force Cross. But the most moving moment came at the Montana cemetery, where Jamie Carrick's family and Marlowe's distant relatives gathered for a private memorial. Jamie's mother, now elderly but still sharp, spoke about the two pilots buried side by side. "My child loved flying, loved the mission, loved the Corps, even though the Air Force is different, you know. But most of all, loved Marlowe. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. They were warriors together. They were partners in every sense. And when death separated them, Marlowe spent 8 years honoring that partnership by being the best pilot she could be, by saving every life she could reach, by flying every mission like it was her last chance to make their love mean something. I'm grateful they're together now. I'm grateful my child had someone who loved them that completely. I'm grateful for the lives they saved and the example they set. And I'm grateful that finally, people understand what they were to each other and what that meant. The words broke through decades of official silence and cultural discomfort, stating plainly what everyone had known but few had acknowledged. Marlowe and Jamie had been in love, their relationship as real as any marriage, their partnership as meaningful as any bond recognized by law or custom. The acknowledgement didn't change facts but altered context, transforming Marlowe's final mission from individual heroism into something more complex. A woman honoring her dead partner by living according to shared values, carrying forward a mission they'd started together, sacrificing herself not just for strangers, but as an act of devotion to someone who died too young. The reframing deepened rather than diminished Marlowe's sacrifice, adding emotional weight that made her choices more rather than less comprehensible. 30 years after her death, Marlowe Torrance existed primarily in memory and myth, her life reduced to stories told by veterans and lessons taught at military schools. The Marines she'd saved were approaching retirement age themselves, their children grown, their own service records complete. They'd lived good lives, raised families, built careers, contributed to communities, all possibilities created by a pilot's decision 3 decades earlier. Some had stayed in touch, maintaining bonds formed in the Koringal Valley, attending reunions where they shared memories, and supported each other through the challenges of civilian life. Others had drifted apart, pursuing separate paths that shared only the common foundation of survival bought at extraordinary price. But all of them, in quiet moments of reflection, thought about Reaper 2-1 and wondered if their lives had justified her sacrifice. The question had no answer, only the imperative to keep trying, to keep striving, to keep making choices that honored the gift they'd been given. At Bagram, long after American forces had withdrawn from Afghanistan, local people maintained a small memorial near where Marlowe's aircraft had landed. They didn't know her story in detail, didn't understand the tactical decisions or the impossible timeline. They knew only that an American pilot had died saving soldiers, that she'd shown courage that transcended nationality or politics, that her sacrifice demonstrated something universal about human capacity for valor. The memorial was unofficial, created and maintained by Afghans who'd worked with coalition forces, who'd seen enough war to recognize heroism when they encountered it. They placed flowers at the memorial on the anniversary of her death, a gesture that meant nothing to military historians, but everything to people who understood that honor wasn't exclusively American or Afghan but human. The gesture suggested that Marlowe's legacy extended beyond the institutions she'd served, resonating with anyone who valued courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to stand between danger and innocence. Her story had become myth now, details worn smooth by repeated telling, truth and legend blending until distinction became impossible. But myths serve purposes that history cannot, providing moral instruction through narrative, demonstrating values through example, inspiring action through story. Marlowe Torrance had become a myth, her actual life less important than what she represented. The warrior who served without recognition, who valued others above self, who died making a choice most people would consider insane and a few would recognize as transcendent. The A-10 pilots who flew reactivated aircraft into new conflicts carried her example like armor, protection against the fear and doubt that combat inevitably generated. When missions became difficult, when risk seemed excessive, when the safe choice was retreat, they thought about Reaper 2-1 and the standard she'd set. They asked themselves what she would do, knowing the answer would always be, stay on station, protect the infantry, complete the mission regardless of cost. That standard was impossible to maintain perfectly, but the attempt elevated their performance beyond what they'd achieved through training alone. 50 years after her death, most people who'd known Marlowe personally were gone, their memories lost to age and time. But her story persisted, taught at military academies, referenced in tactical manuals, studied by scholars examining the ethics of combat decision-making. She'd become a case study, her final mission analyzed from multiple perspectives: tactical effectiveness, moral philosophy, psychological resilience, organizational culture. The analyses produced papers and books and dissertations that examined every aspect of what she'd done and why it mattered. But academic study, however thorough, couldn't capture what the Marines had felt when her voice came over the radio, what the ground had looked like from her cockpit, what thoughts had occupied her mind during those final moments in the Afghan canyon. Those experiences died with her, knowable only through imagination and empathy, and the attempt to understand someone whose values drove them to choices most people would never make. The attempt itself was valuable, forcing students and scholars and military professionals to confront questions about service and sacrifice, and the price of principle. Some concluded that Marlowe had been reckless, that her decision violated sound tactical judgment, that she'd thrown away her life unnecessarily when she could have disengaged and let other assets provide coverage. Others argued that her choice exemplified the highest form of military virtue, that she'd correctly valued the mission above personal survival, that her sacrifice was exactly what a warrior's oath demanded in such circumstances. Both positions had merit, and neither captured the full truth. Marlowe hadn't been reckless or suicidal. She'd been calculating, weighing lives against time and ammunition against threats, making decisions that optimized for mission accomplishment rather than personal survival. She'd known the cost and accepted it, not because she wanted to die, but because 43 Marines needed her more than she needed her own future. The calculation was brutal and clear and absolutely correct by the standards she'd chosen to live by. Whether those standards were right or wrong, sustainable or insane, admirable or tragic, those questions remained open, answered differently by different people according to their own values and experiences. But nobody could deny that Marlowe had lived according to her principles completely, that her final mission was entirely consistent with the person she'd been throughout her career, that her death represented not an aberration but the logical conclusion of a life spent valuing others above self. That consistency, that absolute integrity between values and actions, was perhaps her greatest legacy. The demonstration that it was possible to live by principle rather than convenience, to make hard choices without complaint or hesitation, to measure success by mission accomplishment rather than personal advancement. In a military culture that increasingly emphasized career management and risk mitigation and careful navigation of organizational politics, Marlowe's example was simultaneously inspiring and troubling. Inspiring because it showed what was possible when someone truly committed to the mission. Troubling because it suggested that such commitment was incompatible with long-term career success, that the system rewarded calculation rather than dedication, that warriors like Marlowe would inevitably be undervalued until they proved their worth through sacrifice that came too late for recognition to matter. The tension between these perspectives drove ongoing debates about military culture, about what the services claimed to value versus what they actually rewarded, about whether organizations could create systems that recognized excellence before it manifested in dramatic final acts. Some reformers used Marlowe's story to argue for cultural change, for evaluation systems that measured mission accomplishment and peer respect rather than administrative efficiency and promotion timing. Others cautioned against over-romanticizing her sacrifice, warning that encouraging such behavior would lead to unnecessary deaths and survivor guilt among those who'd been saved at others' expense. The debates were earnest and thoughtful and ultimately inconclusive, limited by the reality that military culture couldn't be engineered through policy, that values were demonstrated through action rather than stated through regulation, that the gap between what institutions claimed and what they rewarded would always exist in organizations that served multiple masters with competing priorities. But the debates themselves mattered, forcing continuous examination of assumptions and biases, preventing complacency, maintaining tension between ideals and reality that drove incremental improvement even when transformation proved impossible. 100 years after her death, when all direct witnesses were gone, and her story existed purely in historical record and cultural memory, Marlo Torrance remained present in military education and tradition. Pilots still touched her memorial at Yuma before deploying. Marines still referenced Reaper 2-1 when teaching close air support. The Air Force Cross Citation still appeared in ethics courses examining combat decision-making under impossible circumstances. She transcended her own life to become something larger, a symbol, a standard, a reminder that service sometimes demanded everything, and that some warriors gave it willingly, without expectation of recognition or reward, because the mission and the infantrymen mattered more than personal survival. The flag that had stood in her cockpit, preserved now under climate-controlled conditions at the Air Force Museum, remained on display beside her flight suit and helmet, and the challenge coins Marines had left at her grave. Children visiting the museum would ask parents what made her special, why she deserved such prominent recognition when thousands of others had also died in uniform. The answers varied in detail but shared common themes: courage, sacrifice, duty, honor. Words that meant everything and nothing until embodied in specific actions, specific choices, specific people who demonstrated their meaning through how they lived and died. Marlo Torrance had been one such person, neither perfect nor unique but exemplary, showing what service meant when taken to its logical conclusion, demonstrating that the abstract values military organizations claim to prize had concrete manifestations that demanded more than most were willing to give. Her example endured not because she was special but because she was exceptional in the original sense. She'd taken principles others claimed to share and lived them completely, without compromise or hesitation, measuring her life's worth by lives saved rather than promotions earned or recognition received. That commitment, maintained through obscurity and underestimation and official indifference, validated by death rather than career success, became her legacy and her gift. Proof that meaning could be found in service, that excellence existed independent of institutional recognition, that some people still valued others above themselves enough to make the hardest sacrifice when circumstances demanded it. The SEALs who'd first saluted her empty cockpit had understood this instinctively, recognizing a warrior who demonstrated values their own community claimed to prize. Their salute hadn't been for a fellow service member or even for a fallen comrade, but for someone who'd shown them what excellence looked like when expressed through different platforms and missions, reminding them that honor wasn't exclusively theirs, but belonged to anyone willing to pay its price. In the end, Marlo Torrance's story wasn't about heroism or tragedy or gender or military aviation or any single aspect that analysts emphasized. It was about choice, the choice to care when caring was costly, to serve when service demanded everything, to value strangers' lives above personal safety, to measure success by others' survival rather than own advancement. Those choices, made consistently across a career that others dismissed as mediocre, culminated in a final mission that transformed underestimation into legend, obscurity into remembrance, and one pilot's death into a standard that would outlive memory and persist as long as warriors gathered to tell stories about the best among them who flew into fire to bring others home.